Thank you, Wanwera. That was a wonderful introduction, and happy Wednesday to everybody. Happy to be here with all of you and presenting to you Life Beyond COVID, or The Uncertainty Beyond COVID. This is a presentation that's broken down into three different phases. First phase is an overview of foresight in the role in thinking long term. The second component of the presentation is an overview of some of the scenarios that we uncover in this body of research. So thinking thinking of it from a scenario perspective of what life may, how it may unfold after COVID. And then the third area is some signals that suggest what life might be like after COVID. So without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Ness. I'm the Director of Business Development, as when we were indicated earlier at IFTF. About a little over a year and a half ago, we began to look at a research project around life after COVID, looking at some of the scenarios that may pop up. And it created this document that you all have access to after the fact. So let's think about COVID and the uncertainty beyond COVID. So when you think about IFTF, we're a 53-year-old research organization, and we look at all walks of life: technology, health, food, learning, work, just all the different phases of life. And COVID is it's a work-related issue, it's a societal-related issue, it's a health-related issue, it's a governance-related issue. So it just covers everything that you can imagine. And because it was such a large disruption on the horizon back last March, we began to look deep at this topic. So 53 years of history of looking long-term at disruptions, at future innovations, at transformations led us to the creation of this document. So one thing that we all know here at IFTF is to make day-to-day tactical decisions, you have to look long-term and balance both the long-term and the short-term world that we live in. There's a lot of urgency around the today and whatever's happening today, whether it's a work-related issue, a healthcare-related issue, a government-related issue. So some of the things seem so big that we have to focus all of our energies on that. We have to remind ourselves to not just focus everything on the short term. Being able to look long-term really helps us appreciate, become less anxious, and understand where life could go and how we can manage it. If we do choose poorly in the short term, our decisions can have legacy effects that last decades, if not centuries or millennia. Here's an image from Chernobyl. And if any of you are familiar with what happened at Chernobyl several years ago, very, very wrong decisions were made, which led to really, really long legacy issues for Ukraine and the surrounding areas, which impacted millions and millions of people. Now, one thing that we do know is humans aren't built to think long-term, but it is a skill set that we can adapt to and evolve and learn. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. We also have to remember that we have to really not just focus on the moment, because if we do so, it's going to just scare us and make us feel helpless. We can't just ignore what's going on around us either and just say it's fine. And we also can't just lay in bed and act as if it will go away at some point and be depressed. So how do we do this? Well, we need to imagine that there is some optimistic future out there. Pull us out of this depressed short-term state and help us show that there's a positive future. So it's basically a way to flip the dilemma of the miasma or the caution we seem to live in by leveraging optimistic futures. So how do we mitigate the future shock and help to envision longer-term futures? Some of the things you can do are as follows. Really assess what's going on in the short term. What is the ground truth? What is actually happening out there? What is fiction and nonfiction, and ignore the fiction component. Doing research on the internet isn't ground truth. That's not assessing the situation. Looking to our leaders, our educated leaders in the health, in the government, in the sciences, that's where we really need to focus our energies. Not doing research on the internet to find something that fits our worldview and then discounting everything that seems to be factually relevant. Another thing to do is to look back, to look forward. Historically, if we look 10 years into the future, we tend to look 20 years back because it's a really good indicator of where things could head in the future. With that said, with this project, we actually looked well over 100 years in the past at global disruptions, pandemics, epidemics, wars, depressions, to see how did society adjust, how did society rebound, how did society respond to the big threat to society, and to see if there are things that rhyme or repeat, as a way to see or gauge how humans may react today. And we definitely see that. There were 100 years ago during the influenza pandemic, a lot of people refused to wear masks. That's still true today. We have a maskless group, a group of people that refuse to wear masks. This is also a group that refuses to vaccinate itself. And there are people, we see this resonating and repeating. And it reminds ourselves that humans are the hardest thing to forecast. It's basically because humans have fears, humans don't understand statistics, and humans are just not consistent in their behaviors. We do things in an inconsistent way. So, and they're very, humans tend to be irrational in certain situations. So understanding that, you really have to throw social scientists at projects like this to really understand the human condition. Another thing to do is to collect signals of the future. What's emerging out of there? What could have an opportunity to grow or expand in size or volume to inform where we're headed? This part of the presentation represents the last third of what we're going to talk about. Another thing to do is to look at alternatives. There is not one future. There are multiple future possibilities. And if we explore and talk about and dissect what's possible and plausible and internally consistent as a future scenario, then we can start to look at similarities across the scenarios. If something is similar across the scenarios, the likelihood of that happening is higher. And once you explore the various possible scenarios, you're also in a good position to work with your team, work with your leaders to identify a desired future of all the possibilities out there, and then build a plan to achieve that desired future. So that's really the secret of foresight. It's not to divine or predict the future. It's to work through a range of future possibilities so that you can identify a preferred or desired future and work towards that preferred or desired future. Another mitigation technique is to think through your values and how do they unfold as the future changes and unfolds. What will bloom in the future? What values will you still hold on to? So let's not leave our values behind. Let's embrace them. And constantly reviewing and adapting what we're knowing and understanding is critical. What's changing and how can we change along with it? Now, 11 years ago, in one of our research projects, back in 2009, we anticipated a respiratory disease outbreak, a la the common cold, a la the flu, that did not have a vaccine, that led to a global quarantine, which led to global protests because people couldn't work, people wanted their life back. So this was one of the threats we imagined back in 2009. And 2 years later, in 2011, we identified a zoonotic outbreak as something to be worried of. But we knew by 2021 or so, we would have the following in place: abundant mobile computing, a wide sensor and sensor network. We would have the ability to do diagnostic imaging, and we would have robust social networks in place. And because of these technologies, that would form a possibility to anticipate where disease outbreaks would happen, so you could anticipate quarantine ahead of time to really stop or stall the disease before it continues to move forward. We had a playbook on how to deal with this disease. We just chose in certain government places not to follow the playbook. And if you don't follow the playbook, then the game doesn't go as anticipated. The disease was able to expand, change, mutate. Now we're on the Delta virus. It looks like we have some other variants on the horizon. And if we don't vaccinate everyone in time, we're going to continue to see these variants come So we're not sure yet if this will become an endemic disease where we need to have a vaccine every year, every 4 or 5 years. That's still to be determined, but there are ways of dealing with these kind of diseases, and humans are just choosing in pockets of places not to do so, which means the disease is more likely to be around for years and years and years. Now, one of our colleagues, Jake Dunnigan, has a wonderful phrase. It is better to be surprised by a simulation than be blindsided by reality. And that's the wonderful thing about forecasts and scenarios. If you can talk about a future possibility years ahead of time, you can start to talk about the pros and cons of that scenario. What would you do? What would you not do? What would you invest in? Who would you partner with? What would you train for? How would you change your behaviors? And by doing so, it's a pretty cheap process. It's basically just your time. You don't have to really invest deeply into this scenario. But if you don't do so, if you don't talk about it in advance and learn some things years ahead of time, you're more likely to be blindsided by reality. And that becomes very expensive because now instead of being proactive, we're being reactionary. Now, when we conducted this work, we had a game plan in play. We looked at 4 different alternative views of the future: growth, collapse, constraint, and transformation. Those were the 4 views. It's based on a methodology developed in Hawaii at the University of Hawaii Manoa School by a fellow named Jim Dater. It's a wonderful way of looking at the future. And in doing so, we realized something, that the disease of COVID broke down society and exposed some other vulnerabilities across our global society. And these are the 7 things that we identified. Our health systems are broken. We have economic inequality. There's racial injustice. Our supply chains are brittle. Our political systems are divided. We still continue to have climate emergencies, and our social fabric is just continually fragile in nature. So we can't just focus on COVID. We also have to deal with these other 7 different issues over the next decade or two as we respond to COVID. Every scenario, here's the growth scenario, has a title, has a valuation area, has a short little paragraph that explains it, and then goes through 3 different layers of forecast. There's a response phase, there's a reset phase, and there's a reinvention phase. Now, if we imagine ourselves back last March when this really hit home and we started to work from home, started to close up and quarantine ourselves, I think a lot of us imagined this response phase will last 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, and then we'll go back to life as we know it. So we just have to dig our heels in for 1.5 or 2 months, and then we'll go back to life as we know it. The reality is, when you have a global disruption like that, the response tends to take 2 to 3 years. So we're now 1.5 years into it. We now realize we're probably not going to get everyone on the planet back who wants a vaccine vaccinated until the end of 2023 or sometime in 2024. We're still not sure if we're going to need booster shots or ongoing annual shots or shots every 3-4 years. But the response lasts more than a few months. It's 2 to 4 years or so. And then once the response is over, society kind of comes back to this equilibrium, what we call reset. And a lot of people are going to look around and say, I don't like where we've reset, either personally, at the family level, or at the organizational level. And from there, if you're not happy with the reset, you're in a position to reinvent. And our suggestion at IFTF is to focus the bulk of your energies on the response, keeping people safe, keeping the supply chains open, making sure people can do the things that they need to do to be human as much as possible. But have a smaller group focused on where you'd like to reset. Take agency around this. Where do you want to reset when COVID starts to subside? And then even a smaller group focused on reinvention. Where do you want to be in 10 years? How would you like to reinvent your organization, who you work with, how you do things, who you partner with, what you invest in, what you train for? So response, reset, reinvention, these are 2 to 3 year timeframes, 5-year timeframes, 10-year timeframes. Have some focused response on the 10-year timeframe to inform reset and response. The reset should inform response. So have that. So in this scenario, growth, the focus is on, or the value is on the economy. And let's really leverage all the trillions of dollars we're throwing at response on a focus on growth, on saving capitalists, not saving capitalism, saving capitalists, saving the 1%, so that we can have a high stock market, have a low unemployment rate, and get back to this life as we know it as soon as possible. If this plays out, the way the scenario plays out is a lot of the frontline people who are focused on helping save us from the disease, the healthcare workers, the farmers, the day laborers, the delivery people, the people at the retail stores that are scanning our items are going to find that their jobs tend to be the lowest paid jobs. Their jobs are also the most likely to be automated as we move to reset and reinvention. So a lot of human or contactless transactions, remote healthcare screenings, a lot of things that obviate the need for humans. So those people that saved us from COVID, that delivered our food, that grew our food, that took care of us when we needed to go to the hospital, are the most likely to be automated away from the jobs. It leads to a surveillance state. It also leads to a monopoly in the technology and healthcare world. And the true winners are those who control the debt, because there will be a lot of debt created from this scenario. And a lot of places on the world focused on this scenario right away. They borrowed or created trillions of dollars in new value or new money to do things, to respond. A constraint scenario has to do where we value health and we focus on testing and contact tracing. So data guides our decision making. So the response initially is about data-driven policy. You have things like these data. This is a California, it's hard to see. This is my California pass. So if I enter a space that requires vaccination, here's my proof, and they can scan that 3D code if they want to. It has my name, my date of birth, which doses I took, when I took them. That information is, once you scan the QR code, it's known by the state. It can be verified with efficiency. Where this resets at is algorithms and data become the guiding ways of doing everything. If you want to get to a restaurant, if you want to fly on an airplane, if you want to enter a sporting event or a concert venue, you need to have proof of either vaccination or a recent test that shows you're negative. So a lot of things are done by algorithm, real-time sensor data, smartphones everywhere. If you don't have a smartphone, if you don't have proof of vaccination, it's going to lead to pod-based gatekeeping, the in and the out crowd. So if you have the latest vaccine and proof of that, you're in. If you don't have the latest vaccine or proof, you're out. And a lot of things will be gated that way. And we're already starting to see gating happening this way. The latest conversation is around proving vaccination for airplane travel. And mostly it's a way to help the airlines get out of the decision-making process and just defer to governments and say the government's making us do this, as a way to coax people to get the vaccine. A collapse scenario is where we value political power and we leverage masks and vaccines, or lack of masks and lack of vaccines, as symbols of which team we're behind. So here in America, the left tends to value masks and the vaccines. The right tends to value not masking, not vaccinating as a sign of personal freedom at the expense of societal health. So you have this culture war that's brewing here in America and some other places. And if this scenario were to play out, the federal government kind of collapses because it's really not there, because people in the military, people in the political ranks tend, it's either you're with my worldview or you're not worldview. So you have a mass exodus of people from those controlling forces, which leads to regulation and policy decisions at the regional and local level, to the point where you might have local warlords dictating things. leads to violent protest, divided military, divided police state. And the reinvention in this area is certain factions or geographies decide to exit their current federal landscape. So you could see things like Texas going away or California going away because they just don't like how the others are governing. The fourth scenario is where we value social well-being and we leverage our compassion for one another. And this is called social solidarity. Initially, it's just people helping, checking on your neighbor, making sure they have access to clean water, food, vaccine information, real information. And where it resets is a real sharing economy that's created. About 10, 15 years ago, we were talking about the sharing economy. That really didn't play out. Now it looks like it might play out where we have humans coming together, creating this new possibility. And one thing that we think may happen in this scenario is if this scenario plays out and grows, the people that created this solidarity and focus on mutuality can deal with those other 7 issues in a more structured way because if we deal with climate at the community level, we're going to be more successful than if we just do top down or bottom up. If everyone's involved in the conversation, it plays out really well. So let's dive into some of those signals. And I've chosen some buckets of area that will be relevant to all the people in the audience. We have some work-related signals to start with. So let's key in on those. Twitter and Facebook allow permanent remote work. What this means is for the knowledge workers in their family, if you have access to the internet, if you have access to a laptop and the technologies to connect you with your other colleagues, it doesn't matter where you work. You can work in the mountains, you can work at the beach, you can work on vacation. Basically, you can work anywhere. Now, there are consequences of this. If you work anywhere, if you cross state lines, if you cross federal lines, there are tax implications at the individual level. So it may not be as advantageous as you think to be a full-time remote worker, but it does provide more flexibility at the employee level. And the initial research suggests that productivity has gone up because of remote work, not down. So some organizations are pursuing this and using it as a recruitment process to provide remote work permanently. Now, organizations like Google are also allowing it, but they're changing compensation levels. So if you move from, say, Silicon Valley to rural Iowa or rural Idaho, where the cost of living is lower, they may reduce your salary by 30%. So it's a give and take conversation. We're going to see how this unfolds over the next 2-3 years. But our ask of you with these signals is not to say yes or no if they're happening in Bangkok or Thailand proper, but to just think through what are the consequences if this signal does grow. What if 30% of our workers are now remote workers? How does that impact society? How does that impact our IT? Like at IFTF here, we all had to make sure we had microphones and light boxes, light circles, and additional displays to really do our work. We had to make sure our data infrastructure at home is adequate to deal with multiple Zoom or Microsoft Teams calls, especially if our kids are also at home. If we're having 4, 5, 6 simultaneous streamed events, you have to have some robust delivery at home. And who pays for that? Is that an individual cost? Does the corporation take that on as a cost? A lot of conversations and consequences need to happen to just think through how does this play out over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. How does innovation unfold? How does innovation get spawned? Where do new ideas come from? If we're all in the same office together in a room and putting up things on the whiteboard and doing sticky note exercises and writing things on the walls and bumping into each other at the coffee area, the water area, at the canteen, at the luncheon area, over lunch, over coffee, wherever, that's where ideas tend to spawn. But if we're all remote, working from our own home offices and living rooms and bedrooms, what does that mean for serendipity? How do we spawn it? So I expect over the next year, lots of best-selling business books will be around innovation in a time of COVID, how to be innovation in a remote-only workspace, et cetera. So how do we make sure we're successfully working, but we're also successfully innovating over the next few years? One new door that's been opened is availability of work for people with disabilities. People who traditionally could only stay at home. If now remote work blossoms and opens up more and more so, some places it'll be 2 to 3 times as many people are full-time remote workers. That means a lot of people who traditionally had to stay home because of disabilities can now enter the workforce. So that's a fantastic consequence of COVID in this transition to remote work. Some geographic signals that we're starting to see is if we're all remote working, we don't need as much office space. So initially, a lot of demand for office space and utilization of office space went away. And traditional economics, if there's less demand, the prices go down. If prices go down, that means the taxation on those prices also goes down, and the local government will have less money to pay for services. If less people are going to the office, that means we don't need as much public transportation. And so if there's less demand on public transportation, that means there's less money to fund public transportation. And this public transportation tends to be subsidized. And if our civic institutions and governments don't have as much money, it's sort of like this death spiral that could likely occur in some city functional areas, like public transit. So we really have to rethink areas in the civic space as a consequence of these office space rental prices. Now, one thing that we did see is some technology companies and other companies that have a lot of cash looked at this as an opportunity to buy up real estate. So the Googles, the Facebooks of the world, and others took it as a chance to really buy up some really awesome and key location property around the world. So they take the long-term perspective of 10, 15, 20 years of demand for office space. It'll bounce back at some point. Maybe not for work, maybe it's for living, maybe it's for retail, but owning this real estate for the long term seems to be a valuable investment for some well-heeled organizations. A lot of people have moved to the suburbs. So if traditionally the ecosystem of companies that feed it into the headquarters now have to focus on different areas, they also have to think they have to move. So this is like dry cleaning and childcare, restaurants, cleaning services, et cetera, that were focused on the urban areas. If all the people are now moving to the suburbs, a lot of those places that serve the corporate have to rethink and serve those workers in the suburbs. So really interesting dynamic between the urban and the suburban world. And this, moving far away, a lot of global governments are thinking, if we can't have people travel here for tourism, maybe we could have them travel here for work. So not a week here, but 3 months here, and enjoy the revenue that falls from a remote worker. So coming to Barbados, coming to Georgia, coming to Estonia for 3 to 6 months or a year seems to be a way to offset the lack of tourism dollars coming in. Some travel signals. Global travel, specifically transatlantic and transpacific travel, tends to be subsidized by the business class traveler. The business class traveler pays for about 90% of the profits for these transatlantic and transpacific flights. So if we don't have corporations investing in business class travel, either because of COVID, it's not a healthcare possibility, or because of climate, it increases the cost of carbon onto society, or we've invested in IT and we can do these things remote. We don't need to send somebody around the world, halfway around the world for a 2-hour meeting. Let's do it via Microsoft Teams or Zoom. We see a lot of less business travel over the next few years, which means personal travel or coach travel needs to pick up the cost. So expect the fees for that to go up 50 to 100% to offset this decline in business travel. And this likely won't bounce back for a long time. One way to help deal with the concerns around COVID is to provide a certificate or a way for people to prove that they have the vaccine. So Europe's attempting to do this to bring travelers again to France, to Spain, to Italy, to Greece, places where people traditionally travel to for vacation. Last summer was dead for travel. This summer is about to end. There's still a few days left, but the goal was to use travel as a way to kind of keep those markets and economies going. I know here in California, Californians are encouraged to travel within the state. So if you're not going to Australia, if you're not going to Hawaii, if you're not going to Chicago or Miami or Cancun, at least go camping here in California. Go visit LA and San Diego, go to Legoland, go to Disneyland. So there's a real focus to encourage local tourism, local vacations to make up the lack of interstate and inter-country travel. And then finally, some borders are going to continue to be closed for a long time to protect local health, but also to protect local jobs. So Australia is doing this, and some other nations around the world are really putting up difficult standards on getting into the country. I know Europe is really starting to look at Americans who are unvaccinated and saying, nope, you cannot come here unless you can prove you have the vaccine. Finally, some tech signals, and I actually should rename this economic signals because they're more economic in nature, but they do impact tech. One is called this economic concept of diffusion. It's a process by which a new idea or new product is accepted by the market. So working from home, working remotely is now accepted. If my son or daughter weren't in school, there's a chance that they may pop up and just stand here and look at the screen. I would ignore them. I might pat them on the head. I'm getting used to that, the disruption. Disruptions of kids, disruptions of animals, disruptions of noises are commonly accepted now. But it's not just it's new experiences. It's also new ideas that are now likely to be diffused much quicker. So contactless shopping, home delivery of alcohol, takeout of alcohol. These are examples of things that were not legal in the past, but they're legal, and now they may for a year, and now they may be allowed for a lot longer time. So I've heard of several people say the 10-year perspective should now be a 5-year perspective because of the diffusion of technology across society because of COVID. We're going to see things a lot quicker now because a lot more tech was pushed upon us in such a fast space. And here's an example of if you can't go to a store, you buy it via e-retail, and it looks like we had an acceleration of a year or two of e-commerce's share of U.S. retail. And the other thing to consider is this concept of an experience good. So while you're looking in your economic textbooks for the concept of diffusion, take a peek at this concept called the experience good, which basically means that consumers tend to not be able to understand how they would use something or how it would transform their life unless they've actually experienced it or done it. I'm reminded of my wife's first job after college. She worked in a bank, and she had a management role, and they were unveiling this new concept, technology called the ATM. And her job for a few months was to get away out of the back and just go to the people in the back of the line and have a conversation with them and say, hey, we have this new technology out in front. It's called an ATM. If you use your card, which you have, put it in and put a 4-digit code in, you can take money out. So if you're here just to get money, instead of waiting 20 minutes in line, you can go over here and do it in 1 minute. And once people had experienced the ATM, they very rarely would ever go back in line just to get money. It's a lot quicker just to go to the ATM that's out front as opposed to going into the bank. And you also can do it off banking hours. So another thing about COVID is the increasing awareness of all these new experiences that are out there. And once consumed, people are really in a good position to know the worth or the value of it. So now people will say an ATM is incredibly valuable. We definitely need to have it. But you don't understand the value until you've had the experience with it. So that's it. I know we're now in a position to move to Q&A, and I've used the bulk of my time. So if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me at this email address. There's some time zone differences, so give me a few hours to respond to you, but I'd love to keep this conversation going. And as a final gift to you, I'm going to make sure I send an email to the organizers to share with all the people in the community a link to this research, as well as some guides on how to use the research within your team, within your organization. So again, thanks for having me here. It's been fantastic. Have a great rest of your event, and I wish you all well. Bye-bye now.